No, I think you're like getting at something really interesting, which is, when do we sort of get overly mesmerized by the ceiling of a technology and like forget about like, I don't know, what the expected outcome is or like the median outcome or even sort of the floor in some respect. And I think that happens in investing a bunch, right? With Mudrik, he's the real deal.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so Mario, look, man, you're in New York here. I'm just going to tell people we actually know each other in real life too. This is not just an internet friend situation. No, we were kind of internet friends-ish before we kind of even met. We actually only really met fairly recently, I'll say like in the last 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
But your missus, your wife, Ali, is a really, really good friend of mine. We work together at Charity Water. Hope that's okay to say. But yeah, we are friends.
Yeah, of course.
And yeah, we've recently had dinner together. We've hung out in person. So hopefully this shouldn't be just two strangers talking. We'll get into some details you won't be able to share elsewhere.
Exactly.
But yeah, yeah, so look, man, you've been doing some amazing stuff at A Generalist. Outside of knowing you personally in the real world, in the online world, we were also kind of friends through the pandemic. And we were both, I think you really went full time, with The Generalist in 2020, was it? During the pandemic,
exactly.
right?
Bang
and you were
on.
already writing before that, but you went full time, and we'll kind of talk about that transition today. And I was obviously really ramping up on Creator Lab, so we had a lot of our worlds coming together. I think you also did something with Jack Butcher, the guy I do a podcast with on Not Investment Advice as well. So yeah, lots of worlds coming together, man, and happy to finally get this in the books.
Yeah, totally. I
yeah,
feel like
so
we both also sort of simultaneously became friends with Jack and Trung, like, I don't know, maybe around the
I
same
think
time.
it was
So
a similar time. Yeah, it was everyone was at home, and we
Yeah,
were like,
exactly.
okay, we can't see anyone, but we might as well hang out with people on the internet that we actually have shared interests with. So yeah, definitely in that world. So let's paint a picture of what The Generalist is. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this have read your newsletter or at least some of your briefings. But what is The Generalist today?
Yeah, The Generalist is a publication that focuses on writing like deeply researched case studies on businesses and funds in the tech sector predominantly. So, analyzing things like ChatGPT, Tiger Global, Union Square Ventures, Stripe, those kind of sort of exceptional or exceptionally interesting organizations and movements, and trying to give them sort of the definitive treatment as often as possible. And then in addition to that publication, we have a private community. And then most recently, I raised a small fund to invest in some of the companies that I meet while doing this kind of research.
Amazing, man. Yeah, you're doing the full playbook, man. You're doing, like you've got the newsletter, you've got the owned audience there. I think you've already got 64,000 people reading that every week. And you've got, I think it's a $15 million fund as well, which that you just mentioned, investing in startups. But you actually worked in investing before this, right? It wasn't just you were a random dude writing about stuff and decided to do a fund, which I'm a fan of people doing that too. But you worked in VC before this, right?
I did, yeah. I worked at a firm called Charge Ventures back in, I think it was 2018 that I started there, maybe 2017, and was there through starting The Generalist. And then before that, I had also had like a much shorter sort of intern style experience at a firm called Red Sea Ventures, which was my first taste in venture. And then before, or sort of between those two things, I worked at a startup called &Co, which was bought by Fiverr. So certainly it's a big jump to, I think, run a fund, even a small one, and even, just a one-person shop from the experience I had. And definitely is something I want to make sure I take super seriously. But it did help that I wasn't starting from scratch, and had thankfully done a little bit of scouting with Andreessen Horowitz. And that also, I think, allowed me to have a bit more of a track record than I might have if I was starting from scratch.
Yeah, completely. Well, I just want to ask a very candid question, because a lot of people hear about VCs. There's a lot of memes on Twitter about VCs, and there's some really incredible, a lot of the stuff I've learned about tech has been from blogs written by VCs over the years, or investors anyway, in different forms. And so like, what does a a job actually look like before, like the jobs you did? Because from the outside, it seems like what you're doing is deep research and analysis of industries and companies. So I'm assuming there's a lot of overlap in what you would have done before.
Yeah, totally. I think it really depends on what firm you're at, and particularly like the style of firm that you're at. I think if you sort of look at the past 10 years of venture capital, there's this fundamental conversation happening, which is, should venture be industrialized, or is this a cottage industry that is about craft? And there's really, I think, two schools, and people sometimes get caught in the middle. But on one end of the spectrum, you have the Tiger Global, Andreessen Horowitz sort of mega funds that really are trying to turn themselves into an organization, right? Like it's about being big, being efficient, and scaling. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people like Union Square Ventures. I would say Kleiner Perkins in its newest form is much more like this, where it's still about this kind of smaller craft approach where you have a smaller team. And I mean, research is super important in both of those places, but I think the style of work, the speed you're moving at, all of those things change a lot depending on what type of fund you're at. So for me, I was at a fund in both Charge and Red Sea Ventures that one are like very much on the small side. So they were, sub $50 million funds at the time. And so we were writing really early stage deals and we're occasionally leading rounds, I guess, but like pre-seed rounds. And so at that stage of the stack, you're really don't have any financial data to look at beyond sort of market analysis. And so you start to, I think, lean more on the team, like that initial sort of pre-product market fit traction. And you have to like be a more vision-based investor. Yeah. And so there's definitely parts of the generalist today that overlap with that style of investing. But in many ways, I think the work that I do at the generalist today is actually more similar to what like a larger Series A firm or even growth stage firm would do, because it's a lot more research.
Got it. And we'll get into the fund a little bit later, but I see that your focus is really Series A, it looks like, for your fund as well.
Yeah. I sort of spent a bunch of time thinking about what my advantages are as an investor or not, and where I can sort of run the playbook that I think could be most effective. And so I sort of landed on Series A, and happy to talk through sort of how I made that decision. But it is all very much still up in the air whether that strategy will prove to be good or not.
Well, it sounds, I mean, I know just from speaking to you and reading your stuff, you're very well thought out. You really spend a lot of time and diligence in like understanding where, your focus would be. So yeah, we'll definitely get to that in the second part. Before we jump into all of that, I do want to hone in on this idea of the generalist, like the word itself or the phrase itself. It's just something that I've actually, before I read your publication even, it was when I started Creator Lab, I wrote out, different names, and you do the brainstorming session. I never came up with something like the generalist, but the idea of, I also used to use this phrase, which might not even make sense, but like the expert generalist, and maybe I heard like someone talk about that from somewhere. But I had looked at my own skill set and my interests, and I always saw myself as like someone who was kind of like well-rounded with like interests in lots of different things, but then probably some expertise in like one or two areas, right? Because it's really difficult to be an expert in everything. But I was always, even from like a young age, when I went to Google and started the e-com business and stuff, I was always like, well, one day I'm going to have to hire people. So how do I learn about that? And there's accounting and finance. So let me just at least understand what a balance sheet is and stuff like that. So I'm curious from your point of view, because even on the other pod I do with Jack, and Trung, we had a whole episode on generalist versus specialist and kind of this idea. So I'm curious, why did you choose that phrase, the generalist, and what does it kind of mean to you?
Yeah. First, I think in many ways, I had a very weird professional background before getting into tech. Like I did a bunch of random things. So my first job was at a law firm. At the time, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer and then like maybe get into politics. So that was very disconnected to what I do now. When I realized I definitely didn't want to do that, I spent sort of this year writing a novel and going to culinary school and cooking. And then I went to a master's program that was really focused on international development. So a lot of the things that you were thinking about at Charity Water, for example. And I remember towards the sort of middle end of my period in grad school, I really became increasingly convinced that actually I'm most interested in tech, and like tech in emerging markets was one of the things I focused on, but really it was tech more than anything. And so I remember talking to a few business school professors where I was taking some classes, and they were like, oh, you should look for a job where you're just kind of like a generalist at a startup. You know, you need to just be an athlete where you maybe do some business ops, you do some, you know, business development, maybe some sales, and you just learn how a startup works. And I hadn't really thought of that notion of an athlete or a generalist in the startup world. I was like, oh, I didn't realize you could sort of just find your way in like that. And it was really a consequence of the fact that I had no real marketable skills
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah. You're
But
not like
that
coming in as
maybe,
the lawyer or the CFO or
yeah,
something. You're just, I get what you're saying.
or like even a product person who
Yeah.
would like, you know, because that's a
Yeah.
difficult
Sorry.
role
That's probably the
to
best
crack.
example. Yeah.
Um, and so that was part of it, in that I think it resonates with a little bit of who I am. And then the second part is I always found it kind of a little funny that venture funds would sometimes be like, oh, we're a generalist fund. And it sort of just means we'll invest in anything, right?
Yeah. Give us what
And
we can get right now.
it makes
Yeah.
sense. And, you know, like my fund is a generalist fund in more ways than one. But yeah, I always found that a little funny. And so when I started the newsletter, I was like, okay, this is like maybe a little bit of a wink to that part of venture capital, but also feels kind of true to myself.
Got it. Love that, man. Well, you actually had a recent write up on what was it called? Yeah, who becomes an entrepreneur? 2005 study suggested that the self-employed tend to be generalists, not specialists. And another line I saw here, though VCs often talk about finding a founder that spikes in certain dimensions, those most likely to become entrepreneurs are well-rounded. So kind of what we discussed a little bit earlier. But was there anything else doing that research that kind of like surprised you when you were like digging deep into that world?
Yeah, honestly, lots. So I ended up reviewing, I don't know, 30, 40 different academic papers to sort of just see what is out there. And a lot of it is things that you would probably expect, right? Like there are some papers that say, oh, people who have a higher risk tolerance become entrepreneurs. Some other papers say, actually, you know, that doesn't mean anything. And that's academia, right? There's always this conversation between different positions. But the ones that I sort of pulled into that piece, I think all surprised me in one way or another. I would say that the idea that it is more generalists was something that I thought was surprising. I would have expected that people had sort of maybe a decent baseline of skill across a range of things, but did spike in one area. And at least in this study, it really does seem like parity across a skill set is predictive in some way, which I thought was interesting.
Got it. Yeah.
I would say the prevalence of like mental health disorders amongst founders in particular
This
sort
was
of,
really surprising. Yeah.
yeah, interesting, right? Like you would think, okay, you would be competitively advantaged if you were more stable, perhaps mentally, but the sort of creativity, persistence, ambition that often accompany illnesses like bipolar disorder, ADHD, OCD actually seem to be, again, sort of like predictive in a pretty significant way amongst entrepreneurs, which again, I wouldn't have necessarily expected.
I haven't really read that before either until I read your piece. And then this was related also, this was kind of in your summary. You said you survived a difficult childhood. Running a business is not for the faint of heart. It's perhaps not surprising that childhood adversity may increase entrepreneurship rates. So similar point to the mental health stuff. I'm sure it's kind of linked. But yeah, that's also an interesting one because again, like having interviewed, you know, and met hundreds of entrepreneurs, if not more by this point, but there's a couple of things I always notice just like from the conversations, and this isn't academic, it's anecdotal, but often a lot of them have a chip on their shoulder, right? Like,
Yeah,
and
totally.
that can be both a positive and a negative thing. It often really drives them. And I might put myself in that bucket at one point in my life. Hopefully I've dealt with some of those things by this point, but definitely, you know, a lot of us have that. Where you're trying to prove someone wrong, or you're trying to prove the world wrong, or you felt like you weren't understood correctly. And actually, one of the other points here was the market misjudges you, which is exactly
Yeah.
that. Like when I was in a job, I just never felt I was ever going to be fairly compensated, not just
Yep.
monetarily, but just rewarded. I thought I was always going to be able to do more than the system was going to allow me to achieve, especially in a
Hmm.
company like Google, where I remember like in my second quarter there, I was like killing it. I was so eager. And my first managers literally said to me, if you invent Gmail tomorrow, you will still get a meets expectation. And that was just so
Wow.
stupid to me. It just didn't make any sense. I was like, so you're literally taking the incentive away from me to work hard and like do really
Yeah.
well. If that's not that it should
That's a
only be
broken
about
system,
it. Well,
right?
yeah, and to be fair, that person was like very young and like probably shouldn't have said that, and it was just bad management to be honest. But it was yeah, one of those things where I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So and then later, over time I did feel rewarded, like fairly rewarded for a while. But then when that equation starts to flip and you say, okay, I'm no longer learning what I wanted, the pay is okay, but that's not why I'm
Hmm.
here. I'm here to learn or whatever. And that's when you kind of have to jump ship, in my opinion. So yeah, that was really interesting. I'll definitely link to that one as well because I thought that was really like kind of insightful. And I can't remember if you touched much on age, but that was another thing that I've seen
Hmm.
in the past where a lot of people, we see Snapchat founder or the founder of Facebook or the founder of XYZ company starting at 19, and there's like a survivorship bias there as well. So was there anything
Yes.
on age that you remember from the research?
Yeah, there's a ton of interesting things to respond to some of the stuff you just mentioned. So on age specifically, there's a really interesting study. I want to say it was from Berkeley or something like that, where they studied specifically kind of like venture style startups. So a lot of the time when you look at these studies, they look at entrepreneurship writ large, which could be someone who's running a food stand and someone who's running a Fortune 500. But this really narrowed in on sort of the universe of startups that, at least for me, I spend most time thinking about. And they found the average age of a new venture, the person behind a new venture, was 41.9 years old. So much older than you typically think. And what was most interesting to me was that when you look across different populations, like when they narrowed the scope to say, okay, let's look at just like Silicon Valley or New York or ones that raised venture money or ones that are like in the top 1% or 0.1% even highest performers, does that change? Because you think in your head, okay, but the really big companies are run by these young geniuses.
Prodigies, yeah, yeah.
And actually, it sort of goes the opposite way. The average age actually increases in some of those instances. And so, yeah, I think, probably the press loves those stories. And so as a result, they live long in our memory and sort of have this narrative power. But, plenty of other massive
Yeah, the
businesses
data
get
doesn't
founded.
really say that. Yeah, that's very interesting. So yeah, I'll definitely link to that. I just wanted to cover that up front because I think it's kind of a nice introduction to all the sorts of stuff you're covering and has an overlap with what we're talking about. But let's move on to some of like emerging tech. So I know right now ChatGPT is the hot stuff. AI obviously. In the last year or two, it was Web3 and crypto.
Hmm.
There's obviously these clusters and focuses, and I normally just look at like what are the big VCs investing in, and they're normally indicative of where things are going, and they're not always going to be correct, but then they're kind of directionally at least moving in the right direction. So you just did a great piece on search and chat GPT. So
Thank you.
before we go into the details of that though, if I was asking you like what are some, I guess, areas that are most exciting to you, and then maybe a part two to that are areas that deserve more light to be shed on them, that maybe not as sexy, but you're like, actually, this is a really interesting area where tech can make a massive impact, but we're not necessarily always thinking about it.
Yeah, I think, AI, crypto, there are some really interesting things happening. To sort of touch on those, I would say in AI, I'm like most interested about its impact on media and the content we consume. I think there's like a very real possibility that we reach a point where the majority of the content we watch or listen to or read is basically AI created one way or another. And we're just starting to see the tip of that iceberg, right? We're seeing it with sort of these SEO optimized blogs and maybe a few other things. And you see it
You
in
see them on
ChatGPT.
TikTok. I don't know if you use TikTok, but do you
I
see
don't.
the on TikTok nowadays? And I had a guy called Danny Postmo, who's like a guy who makes stuff in AI, and he's explained it to me that you'll basically get these super viral videos, which is like a tweet that's already gone viral on Twitter, and they'll like put two tweets together with a funny moving background and a trending song, and it's just
Oh,
AI
wow.
generated, and it's automatically going to work because we already know it's working on Twitter. So yeah, stuff
Man,
like that is
that is
already, and that's
interesting.
actually not that hard to make, right? That's not even
Totally.
like a real, new image or new video which can exist in AI. So yeah, that's interesting for sure. But yeah, so media. Is there anything else in use cases there that might be more interesting to talk about as well?
Yeah, I think like, the real interesting part of AI will be when we can start to more easily feed it context that it can leverage for us particularly, or for an enterprise particularly. And I think we're still, missing the infrastructure to do that well. With crypto, I think like this is maybe a really exciting time to invest. And, you mentioned you sort of track
Not
what VCs
investment
in.
advice, but yeah, just
Yeah, yeah.
let's get
I
that
said,
out there. But
thank you. I mean that purely for myself,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
purely for myself and generalist capital, not at all for other people. Especially, crypto is very volatile. But from the standpoint of someone who is thinking about how to invest a fund, I think there's this really interesting question where, on one hand, I think the kill rate of all startups, and particularly crypto startups, is probably going to go way up over the next couple years. But on the other side, I think valuations will correct in a meaningful way, and there will hopefully be a lot less distraction, and hopefully some common sense regulation that enters the picture that keeps people safe and allows this to be implemented more effectively. And so I think that's like an interesting thing to think about. And in some ways, venture capital money is not always a great indication of what is really it's an indication of what's hot, but maybe not always
That's a
of
good point. Yeah,
what
where the
is the
value is or
most.
where things are actually going to move.
Yeah. And then I would say the final piece that maybe I would like to understand a lot more about, and I hope to spend more time on this year, is really around sort of the tooling for the biotech revolution. And so less about the sort of hardcore sciences and more about what are the next generation SaaS tools or work products that people that are building these game-changing vaccines and other products will need to do their work. Because I do think there's so much fascinating stuff happening there, and there's probably some interesting opportunities on that maybe second layer that helps support that revolution.
Yeah, 100%, man. Yeah, and that's a really great example. You mentioned valuations there, and we'll get on to your process, deal flow sort of stuff in more details in a little while. But just curious, are you already seeing valuations come down? Because obviously the public markets have obviously corrected significantly in the last year, especially in tech, obviously being hit very hard with high interest rates, high inflation. Are you seeing that in the private markets as well? Because I'm assuming you review decks and speak to founders up for investing stuff. So yeah, what is the pulse in that world?
Yeah, I would say, I'm sure people who see many more deals and have a better beat, but from my vantage, I think things are meaningfully lower than they were in 2021. And, in 2021, I was just doing this as a scout. So again, like, a smaller sample size, but definitely very different from then. I would say crypto sort of lagged behind the rest of the market, at least at the deals that I saw, that even though the sort of publicly traded tokens were really crashing, some of the private rounds were being done at like what felt like 2021 prices. I think that has maybe changed a little bit in the last couple months. But if I had to guess, I think there will be further correction, and especially on the crypto front, because I do think a lot of interest will sap away from it, and the folks that were maybe sort of just curious will maybe shift their interest towards AI or back to sort of their core focuses from the past. And so I suspect there'll just be a little bit less competition around that stuff that will drive the prices down. But I think, the broader question is, does any of this really come back to the highs that we saw in 2021? And that feels like a long way away.
Gonna hurt my feelings now, man. This is
I
the
think
good
it's
old days. The good old days.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be tough.
Monkey JPEGs were going for 500 grand on the internet, and no one seemed to think that we were in a weird world. Yeah. Well, I do want to touch on the crypto part. We'll come back to ChatGPT in a second, but since you talked about crypto, I know both of us are being quite involved and curious about that world. While the craze was happening in the last, especially last year or the year before, you did some really great deep pieces with, so many different parts of the ecosystem. I'm just going to ask a very honest question, because you obviously covered FTX and you covered Do Kwon's, Luna and stuff as well. I'm sure. I think you even interviewed probably both of them, right?
Yeah,
The
for
founders.
the pieces.
The honest question, I'm not trying to get you in trouble, it's just the honest question of like how you felt afterwards when things have, crashed, especially with FTX and, Do Kwon's situation, because and just for someone who didn't meet any of them, I did actually have the president of FTX on the other pod, and seemed like a nice guy. And from the outside, FTX looked like it was killing it, right? Like, so we were not the only ones who were, surprised when everything came crumbling down. But yeah, what was your feeling when a lot of this was happening? Because did that really just like throw you off and say like, well, I met these people and they, seem to be legit in these ways? I'm just curious what your take was when that all happened.
Yeah, totally. I'm definitely game to dig into it. I think in many ways it was probably the business story of last year, right? I think anyone that was involved in crypto in one way or another probably either should be updating their priors or already have. And for me, I think it was like it required a big rethink. I've written a piece called The Casino and the Genie, which if folks are interested in sort of how I've reframed or how I think about this a little bit more now, I think that's helpful because I wrote it basically right after the FTX crash as I was trying to make sense of it for myself. And then I also, I'd say, reflected on it in the year 2 piece of The Generalist. But the high level, I think, is that I really underestimated how much of crypto is dominated by frauds of one kind or another. And, more broadly by like speculation games, by gambling. And in theory, if everyone knows they're gambling, I don't see a problem with it. I think the issue is that a lot of the gambling games that crypto plays are rigged in some way. And that people end up getting burned that don't know that. I think the other part is that the people running these gambling games are often dishonest and will steal money from effectively these forms of speculation. And that because of that, the really interesting things that can happen in crypto get overshadowed, don't get the attention maybe they deserve, and get tarred with this brush of being a gambling house, being a speculation game, being a fraud. And FTX, I think, was for me at least the best disguised fraud and gambling house, where I really, really did not see that coming. Up until the moment that Sam's tweet sort of saying that, they were going to do the Binance deal came out, it seemed unfathomable to me that this, and also the extent of it, like in the weeks that followed. And then that sort of, I think PC did with the Vox person where they got the DMs,
from the DMs
out.
Yeah.
It's just like, I was like, oh my gosh.
What is going on? It was crazy.
I didn't spend a ton of time with Sam, maybe like a cumulative 3 hours across a few conversations, but enough that I really felt like, okay, if you talk to someone for 3 hours, usually I would think I would have some reaction if they were completely, like extremely dishonest. And I did not feel that. And so I think it has sort of taken a weird element where I think I'm a bit more suspicious now, which I hope doesn't stick around forever, because I don't think that's like a particularly
But
healthy way
maybe
to live
like
your life.
maybe like if it's always clouding you, maybe not a good thing, but maybe a little bit of skepticism and, you know, doing a bit more digging. And I'm not saying you didn't do digging there, because you wrote a long piece and did lots of research. But I mean, it seemed like, I think FTX is a very specific example, to be fair. Like he basically duped everyone, right? It wasn't just me and you reading from the outside or
Yeah,
doing an
yeah.
interview with him. It was like the best investors in the world were in there. And you would assume that there's some diligence that's happened in that
Hmm.
process. And yeah, so that was a very, I mean, there's going to hopefully be a film on it one day, and we're going to be able to
Yeah.
watch it and be like, wow, we didn't even know
So
all
that's
those
how
crazy
he
details.
did it or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And
I mean,
there'll
he
be the
gave me
book as well.
access
So, oh, yeah,
to
go
a
ahead.
whole data room. I mean,
Oh,
the
really? Oh,
data,
damn.
yeah, when I wrote the piece, he was like, "Hey, I'll give you access to the data room of our last
Oh,
round."
wow.
And so I thought, like, wow, I'm getting way more information than
Yeah.
I ever get on a company.
And
Like, I
you
got
did
to
you even
see,
ask for that, or was that just like something he offered
I
up?
think I said, "Can you send me the deck, maybe?" And I think he just, sent me everything basically.
Cool.
Um, and so, yeah, I was seeing like traction numbers on a month by month basis, all of these other pieces that I never get that. So to me, it was almost like I felt more confident in that piece
Yeah,
than
he was
many
oversharing.
others.
Yeah.
But I guess in hindsight, it was kind of, I don't know, maybe that was like a good tactic from his position to try and overshare. So, there was no concern. I don't know. It's all
Yeah.
still so strange, but yeah, all to say, to loop it back to crypto in general, I think the uh, fundamental lessons for me have been, I probably over extrapolated short term traction for some of these projects for like how effectively they could last in the long term. And there were so many projects that really just flamed out that I probably was too bullish on. I think for Terra in particular, like we talked a lot about the death spiral possibility, but ultimately I think I underestimated it because it happened.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And this,
and then
so to clarify, that was a piece you wrote, and you called out like potential flaws or problems in the design of their whatever they have. So that was something that eventually unraveled based on that.
Yeah, and same with FTX. Like, we didn't know that. We didn't say, "Hey, we think this might be a fraud," but we did say like the connection between Alameda and FTX, like could be concerning. The data we had at the time suggested they were becoming more independent, but as we now know, that was like very much not the truth.
Yeah, yeah. They had a
So
back door into the the company.
yeah,
So yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
But
But again, how
yeah,
would anyone know that from the outside? You wouldn't know until it comes out, I guess. So
yeah,
yeah,
you'd
that's
probably have to get someone inside who was like very senior, who knew, or yeah, I don't know. So crypto is something to be treated with caution, but
yeah.
I remain interested and
Yeah,
excited by the long-term potential of it.
100%. Yeah, and I didn't want to turn this into like a super negative conversation, but
No,
worth
it's all good.
us
I feel like
touching
I
on
talk
that.
about it as soon as anyone mentions it. I feel just like,
Oh yeah,
like some
let's
release I
get it
need
out on
to
the
get out of
table
me. Yeah.
completely. Yeah, yeah.
So sorry for dominating.
No, 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 oh, no. Well, I mean, just on that note, though. So on the positive side, like you said, valuations are coming down, and this isn't just XYZ coin. This is like companies being built as well in the space, whether that's protocols or actually wallet providers or whatever else it might be. So I'm curious, in Web3 and crypto specifically, are there particular types of use cases or products you're hoping to invest in, and like use cases you're like, well, this is really missing in the space, and these are the sorts of companies I'd like to invest in?
Yeah, the sort of framework I have in my head is really on investing in sort of what I would call Web 2.5 companies that sort
Yeah,
of bridge this old world and new world.
got it.
Other people use that framing to mean other things, but for me, what that really means is companies that have like obvious customers today that have a need for this service one way or another, and companies that are using crypto to solve something that really couldn't be solved without crypto. And so I think a lot of the last cycle, we saw things that either were sort of incestuous within crypto, where, some of these DeFi applications leverage crypto for within itself and, can kind of keep that spinning, or things that sort of seem to use crypto for no definitive reason. I think I really like these companies that have non-crypto customers and are using crypto for something that is impossible to achieve otherwise. And so, for an example, there's a generation of companies that are coming out that are trying to build neobanks on crypto rails. And we'll see what happens in that space in general. But I think there are real structural reasons to believe that unlocks different types of use cases. And one of them being, for large parts of the world, currency volatility is a huge problem. You can have your earnings degrade by as much as 20, 50% or more a year, and you are only able to save in your local currency. And so if you have a product that allows you to shift your local money into a synthetic dollar of one kind or another, you're basically preserving the real value of that in a way that cannot be done in your local currency. And so that's like one very small use case. But if you think about the scope of the large swaths of populations that would find that valuable, I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Cool.
And so it depends on stable coins, of course, and that is always a risk in and of itself, and regulation is a risk there too, for sure. But those are the kinds of problems and approaches I think are really interesting to think about.
With a real use case, yeah, for sure. And just to quickly define, how would you define a neobank versus a regular bank, just for someone who hasn't heard that phrase?
Yeah, so a bank with probably 0 branches, and that is tech first. So you're probably talking about an app that you log into. You can use it to spend, save, send money different places. So, in Latin America, that would be something like Nubank. In America, it might be like Chime, Revolut in Europe and the US. And so it's basically, banks that are tech first and stripped away the sort of human capital and real estate costs to be more efficient.
Yeah, but do you know what's really funny? I was watching a Premier League football game on the UK version of TV. However, I did that, we will not talk about. But I was watching on my TV and I saw all the UK ads. And funnily enough, Chase, as in the US bank Chase, was advertising that they it's like an online only bank for the UK. It looks like they're targeting. I didn't know that until, I haven't dug into this. I literally just saw an ad. And it doesn't look like they have any branches, but they're basically pitching this product, which is essentially a neobank equivalent, but it's Chase.
It makes sense.
And it's the online only version. And then, but in the ad, it said something like 100 million Americans use Chase or use this product. That it was kind of combining the two. It's kind of smart. It's like you're taking a brand that people have heard of and creating a new experience with probably very low cost compared to having a bunch of branches there. But yeah, that's an interesting world. Fintech as a whole as well is just a whole emerging field. When you look at your segments where you're looking to invest, do you look at fintech and crypto overlapping quite a lot, or do you see them very much as two different things?
I think they're pretty overlapping, to be honest. I'm sure other people will have a different vantage, but ultimately I think over time a lot of what we think of as crypto today will just sort of become abstracted out, and it will just be used to achieve things that can be done more efficiently that way. And sometimes, they will be done more efficiently through, quote unquote Web 2 rails. But I think they're really tools or systems that can work in tandem to do things together. And I think you see that even with some of the Web 2 neobanks that have embraced crypto in one way or another, because I think they recognize one, this can be a potentially interesting consumer service. And two, there are some things that, maybe we can do more efficiently with this new technology.
Yeah, brilliant. So why don't we move on to the meaty subject of ChatGPT versus Google. This could be a 2-hour discussion in itself. And again, if people are listening to this for the first time, I've done a few episodes on AI on Creator Lab, last few episodes, and we've done it on NIA, No Investment Advice, a bunch of times as well. But you wrote this brilliant piece called All the Answers, and it was all about essentially, the threat to Google with something like ChatGPT coming along, and how you think things might play out. So I did want to dig into that a little bit. like what, just I guess to kick this off, like how do you see this playing out? I mean, we've seen the wonders of ChatGPT for, very small use cases, and it looks magical when you use it for the first time, but I'm curious to see how many people are actually using it for their day-to-day lives. But yeah, curious how you really broke this problem down and thought about it.
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing that I tried to think about was like, what is the history of how people try and get answers to questions? And if you sort of look at the different movements over the centuries, it's all about sort of compressing the time and the distance between asking a question and getting the answer. And so, in the old days, maybe that was literally going to an oracle and traveling, hundreds of miles and days to seek the counsel of some wise or religious person. Then we sort of got the written word, which allowed us to create libraries that we would visit. Then you get sort of innovations. We're jumping quite a bit here, but like the Yellow Pages or the Encyclopedia Britannica and all these things that you can then start to bring into your home and shorten the time. And then Google basically took all of that and compressed it into a fraction of a second, where you ask a question and you get infinite answers in, literally milliseconds in many instances. And so I think the question for me is like, where does ChatGPT shorten that journey for someone? Where does it allow you to get from question to answer faster than Google? And I think the real places it's better are on questions that have like context that are really important, where you can essentially say like, hey, I need to ask a compound question here, where I need to feed it some information and then get it back in some way. And so you can think of it, as very different in Google in that way. It's not really possible to ask Google a compound question. I think the other way is where you need to modulate the output, where you want to say, hey, I don't just want the answer, but I want the answer in this specific way. And ChatGPT has the ability to generate. It's not just synthesizing, it's actually saying, yes, I can make this a poem or a legal document or whatever else. And so it's much better than Google at that. And then I think the final place is where you think about it in just like pure original content, where you want something created from scratch. And again, that, it's questionable whether that's what you actually should be expecting from a search engine, but I think it's obviously different than Google in that respect. I think the interesting thing is that most of the searches that we ask Google for are not that kind of question.
Yeah.
We're usually asking like, where is the bank, or take me to Facebook, or like all of these really transactional style of questions. And so I think we're going to discover where chat as an interface is most important, and where AI is most effective, because I don't know if AI is going to really help with some of those transactional ones in any phenomenal way that is different than today, because Google already uses AI to improve its results, I'm sure, to a significant extent.
Yeah.
But with these really complex questions, I think that's where we start to see like this huge potential for AI to become more of a colleague or an assistant that can actually do work.
Yeah, no, that's a great frame for it, man. Yeah, and I think the key word there that I heard was assistant or colleague. Like that's a idea that I've heard more about in the last few months, as like a co-pilot or a, someone who's boosting your productivity or ability, right? So writing a poem is a fun example of that, but example I talked with Ben Tossel about was like a travel co-pilot or an assistant, essentially, which is actually a very interesting example, because travel is currently generally better. Well, it depends what part of travel. So you talked about different types of searches. So you were saying there's transactional ones, there's like navigational is another phrase you'd use for like navigate me to a website or to the bank. But another one is like, I always think of it as like what was monetizable for Google mostly, right? They obviously monetize across many categories of search, but specifically like ones with commercial intent are travel, obviously commerce and shopping, but like travel is actually one of the biggest verticals. So I mean, Google's biggest client for a long time was Booking.com, and
no way.
and I don't know, I think that's public knowledge, but whatever. So, but they would be basically bidding on, from my understanding, like any hotel or any kind of like hotel in Barcelona or anything to do with accommodation in a plus city, they would want to
Yep.
be making sure their brand shows up and getting people into their funnel. So it's not to say that I think there's actually an amazing use case for someone creating a real assistant for travel, but a lot of these things sound amazing until you actually use it, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of how I feel a lot about crypto and
Yeah.
funnily enough, even like the football world right now, which I know we're both a fan of, it's like you can kind of hype up something that hasn't happened yet, and there can be, like I'm going to talk about football because I got to shoehorn it in, but your team is Chelsea. You guys just signed a player called Mudryk, who Arsenal were trying to get. And like, you guys paid a lot of money for him, but that's the magic, right? You're like, well, he could
Yep.
be this amazing player. We don't know yet. He's played 20 games, but he could be, the next Ronaldo, the next Messi, whatever. Whereas Arsenal ended up buying a player who's tried and tested in the Premier League because we didn't get the player we wanted. And it's less exciting, right?
Hmm.
And so similarly here, there's a thing of like, well, one day we could have this, utopian world where crypto runs everything and we don't pay transaction fees and there's no wait time for, ACH or wire transfer. And then on the flip side here, there's this amazing travel assistant that knows your preferences and can book it for you and get you that reservation you needed to spend 10 hours researching. And the thing is, until it's actually being created and it actually is doing that for a large amount of people, it's just like a sci-fi,
Hmm.
idea. And so we're getting way. That's why I think ChatGPT was so cool, is because it definitely was up a notch from what we're
Yep.
used to seeing, but we're still quite far off something like that where it's really really useful for those category of searches. Whereas I'd say like for coding, right? Let's say technical
Hmm.
or like you're doing stuff in Excel, that stuff, the technical stuff, it seems to be really really amazing for. So maybe just because the data sets are already kind of there and it's a bit more binary in some ways. I don't know. Do you agree with that, or do you think there's other types of categories I'm not really thinking about there?
No, I think you're like getting at something really interesting, which is, when do we sort of get overly mesmerized by the ceiling of a technology and like forget about like, I don't know, what the expected outcome is or like the median outcome or even sort of the floor in some respect. And I think that happens in investing a bunch, right? Where people sort of can become either focused on the floor or the ceiling. And I think in a lot of the technologies we're talking about, the ceiling is so high. And so people get really excited about that. And there is probably some rational uh, reason to invest in something with such a high ceiling, even if the expected value is kind of, the probability of success is low. If the ceiling's high enough, maybe you're like, hey, this is a good venture style bet. Um, and and I think there's, maybe some of that just happens even outside the investing world with how we feel about things, how excited we get. With Mudryk, he's the real deal.
Yeah, there we go. I had to shoehorn in some football
I have
content
to.
for the people who like it. But yeah,
That guy.
hopefully I explained it well enough so even
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
don't follow football, you kind of get the idea. It's something that you're excited by because you don't know. I mean, another example is like relationships, right? Like,
Mm.
early on, like the people when you're young, you're like, oh, that person could just be this amazing thing you don't know yet. And then when you look at real successful marriages, they know all their flaws,
Yeah, yeah,
like they deal with their flaws and they're like, well, that's okay, they're not perfect but they're amazing for these reasons. And that is like that, it's almost like a maturity in understanding, well, everything has its flaws, right? Like even
yes.
ChatGPT, I mean, you wrote about it in your piece. You said serious limitations hamper ChatGPT. It was like the summary. But there's even now there's searches that just will result in like terrible answers, even for
Mm-hmm.
ChatGPT. And that kind of brings us on to like Google and Microsoft. So Google just recently announced Bard, is it? So that's their equivalent
Yep.
product of ChatGPT. They've been working on it for a long time. A lot of people don't know, but a lot of OpenAI stuff is basically based on Google's research originally.
Huh.
This big
That
paper
makes
that came
sense.
out, I think 2015 or 16. So
Mm.
they basically have very similar stuff
Yeah.
from a technical academic point of view. And my kind of feeling on this, even being ex Google, is until it's out in the wild and people are playing with it, I can't even compare them yet, right? And
Mm.
so I
Mm.
know people are starting to play with this stuff, but it's still very early. But with Google specifically, they just can't get away with the same level of like their threshold for excellence in
Yes,
this has to be way
exactly.
higher because
Hmm.
there's a lot more on the line. And they also have the innovator's dilemma of, well, our whole business is based on providing search results and essentially relevant ads, whether that's search or display ads or video ads. And now there's something that you might not need to click to, go to
Hmm.
a website. And so that brings us on to kind of like this idea of like the evolution of monetizing the internet essentially, but also just this particular segment of, let's say AI assistants or whatever we want to call these things. So like from your understanding, like I'm speaking to people, how do you feel this could go? Because I think you're right in the piece. There's even, there's an argument that this still could be monetized through advertising, like the way an assistant, the way that works. There's still room for advertising somewhere. I'm sure
Hmm.
Google will find a way to do that. But I'm curious what you think. Do you think it's as simple as advertising versus paying for it, or do you think there's anything else that could work here for monetization?
Yeah, I think you're right to cite the fact that Google has a way different threshold, and that like means they just can't experiment in the same way, right? The advantage is that they have like this insane scale advantage.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
if I'm
yeah, for
Google,
sure.
like, which do I trade? I'm not sure. I think
Yeah,
I'd probably rather have the
I'm not
scale and
feeling
have
too
to move a
sorry
little
for them.
slower.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And so, that distribution is impossible to get up to speed with at any sort of pace, although OpenAI is doing very well. I think the question I have is like, is a chat interface actually what we want for a lot of these things? Like for search, I don't know if it's a better experience for most of the stuff we want to
yeah.
do,
That's true.
because Google has really gotten to a place where it is, stuffed with ads, and that is a problem for it. But it's also like extremely informationally dense and really good at sort of knowing, hey, this is when I should surface a map. This is when I should like surface restaurant reviews
Oh
or a
yeah,
booking link or all of these things
yeah,
that,
or a product
um,
image or something like that. Yeah,
yeah, like getting all of that into a chat interface, you could do it probably, but it's
it's
not clear
probably
that
not
it's
the
better to
optimal.
me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And so I think it will be undoubtedly true that these large language models will change how we do search. They'll change how we get answers for things, and they'll change how we create information. But I'm not totally sold that like we're going to be texting with ChatGPT for like most search needs. I think it's more of this like ambient style assistant where you can imagine something where you're just hovering in a Word document or doing some other email or something like that. And that's when you would really want the kind of intelligence and generativeness of one of these AI tools. But yeah, I'm not. I don't know.
That's a
Maybe
good.
that will end up looking really silly, but
Yeah,
I'm not
you.
sold on that.
I think that's a really good point. I think right now the closest proxy is search, so people are just directly comparing the two. But
Hmm.
I do think obviously they have a similarity in that they are giving you information that you're kind of asking for. But I agree, like the use cases just may end up being quite different. And even on the Google side, they have already been, like you said, surfacing what they deem to be the most relevant outside of ads, but the most relevant information. So if you say when is my flight to
Hmm.
the Caribbean, if you've connected Gmail, that can actually show up in your search. Or if you're
Yep.
using the Google Assistant, it will be in there as well. Um, and yeah, so there's that context, that personal level of context, which at the moment something like ChatGPT doesn't have at the moment, but again could work in the future if you connected it to all your accounts. Um, but yeah, it's a really interesting idea to think about, like essentially what is search, and even going back, search has been around for so long now that we just
Hmm.
think of it as like this one thing. But even if you think of like voice search, like right, I still use Siri though it's terrible,
Yeah.
and I really use it just to call my parents. Like when I'm walking, I don't want to take my phone out, and it will work for that. I set a timer or something like that. Essentially, like Alexa, Google Home, and
Yep.
Siri. That's pretty much the only real use cases I have after many years of these things being around.
Totally.
But again, like voice, that is a type of search, right? So voice search,
100%.
and so I actually think like an assistant like this in the long run would be amazing if you could just actually speak to it and go back and forth. And that really is what Google Assistant is supposed to be. It's been around for some
Mm-hmm.
time. It doesn't work at this level, but it was supposed to. I remember a demo internally where it would like call. You could say, "Hey, can you make an appointment for me at the DMV?" And you
Mm-hmm.
know, like next week, you know my schedule already. And so because they have access to your calendar, there's an assistant. It literally calls and it's supposed to be like holding for you for 25 minutes because they're never like gonna answer you straight away. And then it will essentially do that for you. And for something like that, they 100% can do that. Like the
Mm-hmm.
technology is already there. It's just like no one's using that, right? And it's
Yep.
not, the threshold again hasn't been met where everyone knows you can do that. So again, a lot of this stuff I feel like is just science fiction until someone actually creates the version where it really works. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, interesting to see how this plays out. Last question on that, unless you had another point, it looked like you might have something to say there.
No, I was just going to say very quickly. I think that's totally how I would agree with you, and I think that's like maybe one of the most interesting parts of the ChatGPT entrance when we think of it with search, which is that like historically Google has like monopolized every question that humans had, and I'm not sure that's like necessarily a given in the future. And so ChatGPT is like disrupting it, maybe not in the sense that, oh, Google is done or anything like that, but in the sense that I think we will have different venues for different types of questions, and like voice will become a much more compelling channel. Chat might work for some things, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it just sort of like makes that space dynamic and open for creative approaches again, which is like something I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I think any competition and new stuff in this space is welcome for the consumer. So I'm all for it, man. And even just speaking to a lot of people at Google, this is actually like, very, top of mind. Obviously, like the stock got hit pretty badly recently because their demo messed up. It's an existential question that they need to kind of at least position themselves
Mm-hmm.
in a positive light. And that kind of brings me on to Microsoft because especially in our circles right now, it looks like Satya Nadella is the top G. Everyone loves him, and I think he's doing an incredible job too. I mean, he's really, like, to me, he's epitomizing kind of like the wartime CEO
Mm.
idea. And like I love, Sundar and what he's done at Google, but like directly seeing these two go up against each other as like the story of it is actually really kind of fun to watch for us
Mm-hmm.
business nerds anyway. So I'm curious to get your take on how Microsoft is playing this. They obviously have got a major investment in OpenAI, and it looks like they're already integrating them with Bing and Office and stuff like that. So I'm curious what your take is on Microsoft play here.
I feel like Microsoft kind of has nothing to lose, right? They haven't invested, at least as far as I can tell, at anything like the same level Google has historically. And so I don't think there's any question that, could our in-house team compete with Google on this? No. And so great, we have this sort of external team that we have this very, 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 very close relationship with financially and, probably otherwise in terms of how quickly they can spin up product partnerships. So if I'm Microsoft, Bing is a decent business, but if I can take even 5% share from Google by integrating that, like that's really meaningful. That could be
Significant,
billions
yeah.
of dollars.
Yeah.
And it sort of gives them this position in the industry that they haven't had for a while, right? Like no one's been ever talking about them as really an AI challenger in any respect. And so I think this is probably very exciting from their vantage.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, that point you just said there about taking billions of revenue, let's say, which is, because was Google's revenues like 100 billion, was it?
It was
160,
263, I
oh,
think. Oh,
263.
163. You're right.
163, yeah, sorry. Last year, that was last year, so I'm not sure about this year. 163, incredible 91%
No,
market
no, I'm
share.
wrong. It was
Oh,
283.
283. Oh, I have it in
I
your
think 163 was search.
search. Sorry, yeah, yeah. So I'm talking about search, so you're right. Yeah, so
Okay,
Google
yeah,
as a
yeah,
whole is
yeah.
way bigger. But for search specifically, like taking, I remember this, like something I referenced quite a lot from my like learnings from Google was, I think it was like 2010. I was kind of like very new there. And I remember Eric Schmidt talking and someone asking him about Facebook and saying like, are you guys worried
Mm.
about Facebook as a competitor? Because obviously now we all know they were clearly massive competitors. But I remember him saying, we're more concerned about Bing than we are Facebook, which is probably a problem in itself, or
Huh.
maybe the way he was, positioning it. But if you think about it, he was actually, he had a point. His point is that our
Yeah.
search business is so huge, and 1% change from Google to Bing is, massive amounts of money, and an existential threat to our core business. So that's why I think this is even more interesting now, because not only are you just directly saying, hey, someone's now using Bing for some random reason why you would use Bing over Google in its current format probably doesn't make sense. But now actually they're introducing cool new features. And if that can work and it transitions, I think that's actually really dangerous for Google. And I'm even seeing, like, again, very small sample size, but I'm seeing like ads from Bing on like
Mm.
TikTok and stuff where
Oh, that makes
they've got,
sense.
yeah, where they're literally just targeting and showing people the ChatGPT
Mm.
use cases, but they don't even use the word ChatGPT. It's like the new Bing, and this is how it works. And that's smart, because no one should be using the word ChatGPT. It should just be like, this is how Bing
Mm-hmm.
works for them. So really interesting. I think they're doing. Oh, and the last thing on that was a few $1 billion in revenue is actually much bigger than in the valuation, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the market
Totally.
cap will be dented way more than a few billion if that's the case. So yeah, really interesting space. I think we're going to have to watch it very closely. But quite cool to see these two giants kind of going at it. I think Microsoft have just positioned it so well. Like you said, there's not much for them to lose. And it isn't their core business, like you said. So they can
Yeah.
just take a swing.
It's all
So
upside, right?
it's
Bing
all
is like
upside.
surprisingly big. It's 11.6 billion,
That's
right? And
crazy, isn't
so
it?
if
Damn.
you could just double your share from, I think it's 7 or 8% to
Yeah.
15%, for example.
That's great. Do you know what Twitter's like? I'm thinking, what's Twitter's revenue? I
Oh,
might have to.
nothing close. 2 billion, something like that.
Isn't that crazy, right? Like that is
Yeah.
what? Wait, revenue. That is wild. I mean, just the fact that that's 5 times. Yeah, two. Well, I'm looking at 2023.7. So yeah, I mean, either way,
I
it's
think in 2021 it was maybe 4 billion, but I think they said something like it got cut in half with Elon. I don't know, maybe I'm
oh
wrong,
yeah.
but
All right. Well, that's a whole different topic. So,
yeah.
but that's crazy. So Bing is way bigger than Twitter and
Yeah.
probably a few of the other big ones. All right, let's quickly move on. But that was great, man. Really nice to dig into that with you.
That was fun.
Um, on the investing side, so you've raised this fund. We talked about your newsletter. You've grown it to 60,000 plus people. Send a weekly newsletter. You've got this owned audience. We've done lots of episodes on Creator Lab on newsletters, so we'll skip the newsletter part here. But I'm interested to understand, why you chose the venture fund route and how that kind of works for you in your week or your month. Like, how are you spending your, I know you are spending a lot of time writing, so like, how do you even split your week up in focusing on like investing as well?
Yeah, I think it felt like a natural extension, probably partially because of my background, and because of the topic, right? We're writing about these companies, and inevitably end up talking to a lot of the folks that are trying to challenge them and unseat them. So you write about Google, and then you discover all of these new search companies, for example, that are raising money and going after that opportunity, and that happens essentially every time we write a piece. And so when you're thinking about it from the venture angle, at least, I think you realize pretty quickly that you're doing a lot of deep research that surfaces interesting people and allows you to connect with them in a format that is outside of a traditional fundraising environment, right? With founders and VCs in general, I think there's sort of a frenemies style relationship from the founder's perspective. A lot of the time, they know that the VC is the gatekeeper. They have the capital, and they really want to run a process with investors. So you have this sort of more buttoned up story. And I think in some ways, that totally makes sense, but it also isn't always the best way to get to know someone. It requires sort of a faster timeline often to make a decision. And so the work we do at The Generalist gives me a chance to meet with some really impressive, interesting entrepreneurs, but not necessarily in that format. And so I think it often allows me to get to know them differently, and in some cases better. And also, outside of needing to make an immediate decision. So that's sort of, one reason I think it felt like it made sense. In terms of balancing my time, it ends up having I would say, let's say 75, 80% of the work I do for the generalist feels like it is at least indirectly valuable for the fund, and in some cases, like very directly. And, I think that makes it a little easier to balance. I would say I probably spend 20 to 25% of my time on like fund related stuff in a given week. Obviously, that sort of like ebbs and flows. Some weeks, if I have a less intense writing week, I can, sort of push forward on some of that stuff.
Yeah.
And then otherwise, if it's really hectic or it's just a slow time in the market, which I think the last few months have been, things can move a little bit more conservatively.
That makes sense. And so how many like deals are you trying to do a year in something like this? Is that how you set targets for yourself to say, I've got X amount of money that's supposed to last me, X amount of time? Is that how you think about it? Is it that straightforward, or am I just completely making this up?
No, you're right. So people basically, when you raise a fund, often you'll say to people, this is sort of my deployment schedule. I plan on investing this over an, X period, X number of months or years. For me, I sort of initially stated I would do it over probably an 18-month period, but roughly 1 to 2 years. I think it'll end up being closer to 2 years, and partially I think that's been a consequence of me like refining my strategy a little bit as I go through this first fund. My sort of target number of companies is 15, which is on the quite concentrated side of the spectrum. I think a lot of folks tend to want to do a fund that is 50 or more bets in a single.
That's 15 million, so like $1 million per company basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously sort of fees and stuff that comes out of that, but roughly in the range of sort of 800K a company, let's say. Obviously that won't be necessarily evenly split, but my feeling is that from the venture firms I've studied, the ones that seem to perform best have to have like pretty meaningful ownership stakes in the ones that win. There are exceptions, but by and large, I don't necessarily think an index-based approach works as well. Yeah. And I also think it doesn't necessarily map super well to my strengths as a person or as an investor. One, I think I really value having direct, more intimate relationships with people, like getting to know them well, knowing what the problem is with their business at a given moment, trying to be like directly valuable. And sort of having that friendship on this journey with someone. And then on the other side of things, I think frankly it would be hard for me as the writer of The Generalist to be able to also make time for a ton of portfolio companies. And so I think
fair enough.
Both strategically and operationally, it's kind of better for me to be a little bit more focused in that respect.
Yeah, that makes sense, man. And I'm just curious what that process kind of looks like, because I'm sure through The Generalist, I know in your community and people reading your stuff, there's a lot of heavy hitters in the venture world and entrepreneurs. And I know you'll be modest about it, but I just know some of the names even people I've had on the show.
Thanks, man.
So I don't know if I'm even allowed to mention names, but yeah, I'm sure you're, when you said, okay, I'm ready to, raise a fund, I'm just curious, like, what that process looked like for you. Is it just a matter of looking at your network and saying, I'm going to go start speaking to these people and floating the idea? Or did you have like more of a plan around, I need to go to them with this ask and say, I want to raise this amount of money. I'm looking for commitments of XYZ from LPs. Just because I'm to be candid, I thought about doing it, right?
Yeah,
like
totally.
As like a lot of my, stuff for Creative Lab is talking to entrepreneurs and building friendships. And I will once in a while get some deal flow anyway, and I'm not doing it proactively. So that's something I've thought about in the long term. There seems to be some alignment there. So I'm just curious, kind of selfishly, if I ever wanted to do this, how would someone like me or someone listening like approach that problem?
Yeah, I think if you haven't started investing yet, my first step would be like, see if you can do a scouting program, because there's, no downside. You get to invest. You're not, risking your own money at any point, and you get to build a track record. And I think at least having some track record of companies, even if, they haven't done much yet, at least gives people a sense of your taste, and you can sort of start to tell a story about, okay, here's how I got into this deal, here's how I found it. And you can start to sort of, as much as possible, productize that for someone in their head and say, like, here are the unique advantages I have on sourcing, on winning deals, on supporting companies. And so that would be my first step, and I think was very helpful for me in raising it. And then I think I had some people reach out, partially, I think, because 2021 was peak venture, that were like, hey, whenever you do this, we want to invest. And so that, I think, gave me some confidence that, like, okay, if I do this, I'm going to be able to close it. And so I basically started in, I think, February, and it moved pretty quick. Like, it ended up taking, I want to say, a month to the first close.
Wow. That's crazy.
And yeah, it was really, like, I would say, very lucky. I think it was definitely helpful to have had the relationship with people. And I would say I learned a good amount in the process that I would definitely recommend for folks for whatever it's worth. Other people have obviously done this, at much larger scales than me. But I would say, one, as often as possible, I tried to drive people towards a close date, and really treat it like an enterprise sales process, because that's kind of what it is. And so, having a first close date or having something like that, and sort of generating some of that urgency. Two, like, social proof matters a ton, in my opinion and experience so far. So if you're able to get a few, better known folks who maybe are founders of a company or famous VCs or et cetera, that helps a ton. Three, I think, like, you definitely want to try and build out the network step by step. So, when I met someone who ended up investing, I would oftentimes ask them, do you have a few other folks in your network that you think this would be good for? And even if that doesn't end up translating into a direct investment, I think it sort of just, gets you out there a little bit. You never know who invests, who then shares it with someone else. And then I think the, final thing is, I just asked directly a bunch of people I admire, where I went to founders who I had maybe written about, and who I thought were really interesting, and was just like, a good example is the David Velez, the CEO of Nubank, which is, I think, such an amazing business. We wrote a long piece about it.
You mentioned them before, from South America, right?
Yeah, I'm so into that company. I don't even fully understand why, but it's just so cool. And so, like, I was just very direct, and like, it would be incredible to have someone like you aboard. I'm a huge fan of what you've done. Here's what I want to do. Here's my deck. And you never know. Those are sort of like, again, zero cost, big upside bets to try and take.
Definitely,
so
man.
I hope you do it, man. And if you do,
maybe at some
know.
point in the future. Yeah, definitely would. Yeah, appreciate it, man. I think it's one of those. Well, first of all, congrats on doing that, because I think just going through that process, there's a lot of there's mental hurdles, and just like the feeling of like, okay, I'm actually going to that level. And you're taking something that is already a successful newsletter and media business, if you call it that, to, you're essentially the modern creator playbook, right? Like, in a really, I'm not saying it's like copy cutter, but that is the best in class.
A lot of things doing,
like, I know your friend and our mutual friend Packy, McCormack, with Not Boring, and there's a bunch of other people who are doing similar stuff. But it's just really cool to see that, people similar age as well, that we've worked a little while, we've got some experience, we've built some sort of network. But this is an area I didn't even necessarily think about this when I started the podcast, but now, many years later, it seems to be maybe something I would consider in the future. So yeah, that's really helpful. Just to get a specific thing from you, and whatever you're able to share, but when you look at your LPs, is there like an average size you're asking for in commitments, or is it like a minimum amount? Like, how does that usually work? And is there a split between just high net worth individuals versus like other funds?
Yeah, so it's I think the composition is fairly mixed. There were a couple funds, but by and large, it was individuals, family offices, and stuff like that. So it wasn't like going to pitch an endowment or anything like that, which that enterprise sales process, quote unquote, is like multiple years, and brings with it, obviously, benefits, but a lot of challenges operationally, and you have to like really be at a extremely buttoned up in a way that I think, you know, maybe the creator VC fund is probably a different profile. And so, you know, I think check sizes ranged. I think for a few people, I let them put in very, very small amounts. Angel List, I think lets you do as little as $1,000. So if there's someone that you just want to be in there because you want them to be a part of their journey, maybe they're like a family member or something, I let that happen. I think
By the way, was this a rolling fund or was this something else?
No, I did a traditional fund.
Traditional fund, yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rolling fund is really interesting, but I still think in many ways a traditional fund is preferable.
It makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And then there were some folks that put in, you know, like several 100,000 or, you know, even more in some cases.
Amazing. Yeah, that's also, I mean, definitely if I ever think about it in the future, I've spoken to Trung and Jack, we've talked about it in the past as well, because we both kind of like got one foot in the door there. But yeah, definitely really cool to see that happening. I'm sure you're going to get some huge wins in that long term, man, because you're doing the deep work and you're getting access to some really cool entrepreneurs, which I think is really important. So let's
hope so.
Let's hope so. Yeah. Well, look, I know we're gonna have to leave soon, but just to round us out here, I do have a section on the pod called Behind the Mind. I will give you a shout out on your modern meditations stuff that you write on the Generalist, and you basically do these Q&As. I think it's like 9 or 10 questions. I think 10 questions, right?
Yep.
With like you've done it. I think I saw 3 on the site. I don't know if you're planning to do any more, but really cool questions.
Thanks,
but it's a written format versus podcasts, and I actually saw a lot of overlap in some of our questions. So I'm gonna shout out a few, and sometimes I would have borrowed from your version, and sometimes I'll use mine. So we'll see how many we get through here. But yeah, so if you weren't doing a Generalist, what else would you be doing? I guess is the first one to kick us off.
Yeah, it's tricky because I was not good at almost anything else I did as an employee. Like I was fine, but nothing amazing. I think I would try and found another company of some kind or another. You know, maybe something in fintech. That's just like where I end up being most excited.
Cool.
And so I could see myself trying to do that, and I think it would be really fun. I think the other thing is like I would really enjoy being in the writer's room of a TV show that I liked.
Oh, wow.
So, you know,
awesome.
if you could be in the Secession or White Lotus room or something like that, like that would be incredibly fun. So some combo, I think, throughout my life where I could trade off between doing something startup-y and businessy and then something creative. That's probably how I would try and organize my life.
That's awesome. Yeah, I had written down here about writing fiction because I know we spoke about it at dinner as well. And I know you've written the novel in the past.
It's just not possible to make money, unfortunately. Like it's just not difficult. It's not really a job for most people, unfortunately.
Yeah, fair enough. But yeah, I love that, man. That's awesome. Well, there's a contrarian question in here. I'll ask the Peter Thiel version just to keep it classic, but very similar question I've asked, and you've got a version of this. So what important truth do very few people agree with you on? Or if you prefer, your version of the question is, what is your contrarian high conviction opinion? This is a hard one, so if anything comes to mind, great, but if not, let me know, because I would struggle to answer this one.
I'll share 2, and one is more high conviction than another. The real high conviction one I have is that like reading fiction is many times more valuable for someone than reading nonfiction. Yeah. So obviously a very self-serving position. But, you know, I think we have plenty of other formats that are perhaps more expeditious in terms of like actually sort of pushing information into our brains, like YouTube and Wikipedia and all these other things are great at that. Fiction is of a totally different style, right? It's a totally different type of product in that respect, where it really allows you to live multiple lives and build out worlds in a way that I think is almost impossible to substitute with something else. And people might say television or movies, but frankly, I think the form of the novel and writing is really the closest thing we have to being inside someone's mind. And even visual formats, I don't think replicate that especially well. So that's perhaps my highest.
That one.
conviction contrarian one. This is a more controversial one, arguably, but
That's what we're here for. Let's do it. This
I
is the
do think,
cancellation section. So no,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
no, I'm joking.
I do think that sometimes violence is the answer.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. And I've thought a lot about this recently because I watched that talk from who's is it something Lucky, Palmer Lucky, is it? The guy who invented Oculus but now has a defense company.
Andrew.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Do you want to? I don't want to leave you hanging on that, but yeah, do you want to elaborate what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's like, it's not a thing that I would really have either the opportunity or desire to live out in my personal life. But I think, when you look at history, there have been some instances in which the only way where something could be achieved was with some threat or actual violence. And, for that is often comes at an enormous cost. But I do think that many of the sort of biggest moments in our history, when you want to think of like the French Revolution, or, I think the civil rights movement in America, you obviously had Martin Luther King, nonviolent, but you also had the presence of Malcolm X, who was like extremely militant. And I think that in many ways, having some of that fear and
it balances it out a little bit. It moves it in a certain direction. That is a really good one. I'm adding that to my list as well, because I will say that's something and by the way, I might have to, have you got a hard stop right now?
No,
because,
I'm good.
All right, cool. I don't want to leave it on this being the last thing. So I'll ask one more thing, but I want to elaborate as well, because I think the idealistic 18-year-old Bilal would just be like, oh, well, that's not something I would even think about. But the 30-something-year-old Bilal, who's a bit more, actually understands how the world has worked a bit more than I did at that age, is kind of an undeniable thing you just said. I actually agree, because it might be the last case scenario, and no one wants that. No one actually is saying that should be what we do. But 100%, if you look at history, and even like the threat of violence, like the self-defense of violence, right? Like if you just walked around all day, even as an individual, maybe that's actually a bad example. Let's say a country, because that's a little bit easier to
it's less stressful, right?
Less stressful. But let's say the country, the fact that we and you are sitting here on, on computers, that we're both living in America, feeling fairly safe, hopefully, and that's a whole another can of worms, but generally feeling pretty safe, is because we live in a country that has the biggest military in the world, and we are protected by all the things that the threat of violence provide, right? And so we don't have to do it, but someone is. And so you can agree or disagree with that, but I definitely think that's a very good one. So
this is the think boy version of the A Few Good Men speech, right? You need me on that wall, you want me on that wall, whatever.
There we go. Yeah, exactly. All right, well, just to wrap it up, because I think that was a really interesting one, but let's see. I mean, this one was about what you obsessed with that others rarely talk about. Is there one that is coming to mind for you there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really obsessed with subcultures. And so, like the amount of Louis Theroux documentaries I've watched,
brilliant.
Where it's like, Louis with this weird cult, or Louis with the like people who are obsessed with UFOs, or Louis with the swingers, or the orgy, like all of these, anything that has this like very distinct cultural language around it that feels very different than mainstream. Like I can watch or read infinite amounts of content about that.
That's a good one.
Cults, religion, like, obscure religions, things like that. Like I'm very into that.
Great. I'm glad you didn't answer Love Island UK, so we'll save that for a dinner talk only. So
yeah, we haven't watched Casa Amor yet, so that's exciting.
Well, I'm like I haven't even watched anything this season, so but yeah, just a dirty little secret for our listeners. The one thing that me and you both are okay with, the complete tragedy of TV that it is, but is brilliant TV, especially the UK version. It's the turn your brain off sort of TV. So
this is another theory I have, which is that reality to TV today is basically all of the unethical psychological experiments of the 1950s have just been turned into reality TV.
That's
like
hilarious.
The Milgram experiment, all this sort of stuff. We just pay people to do it now, and then we watch the results. Because Love Island, if you think about it, is like a kind of torture, right?
Oh, 100%. And the way they socially engineer
the worst for people.
What they're doing to people on there, and they're socially engineering it so that when someone's confidence starts building up, they'll bring someone else in
Yeah,
to
yeah,
mess with it, and
exactly.
they know, like, there's for people who've never watched the show, don't judge us first of all, but there are times where they'll show
You can judge us.
re-show on the cinema day or whatever, where they're
Yeah,
showing all the secret stuff. And if you think of that as an individual, like, no one is perfect, right? Like,
of
everyone makes
course.
mistakes and has, whatever thoughts or something they said out of line. And imagine, like, watching that back and being like, oh my God, everyone, the person I love or whoever is there with me,
Yeah.
and they're seeing me say something I didn't mean to say. I was off the cuff. And it's actually like, now I'm saying it like that, it reminds me, I mean, I'm not that religious now at all, but growing up, I grew up Muslim, and a lot of the major religions have this obviously idea of Day of Judgment where you're basically being
Yeah, that's so
retold
true.
those stories, right? And so even if you think
Mm.
of those like old stories of, oh, one day there's a consequence that you will have to relive all your sins and all the bad things you did. So basically, someone's watching over you, so be a
Wow.
good person or
Yeah,
whatever. You can argue if that's a good way of doing it, but it's basically the same thing. So that's why I actually
it's very
think
true.
this is definitely getting real think boy on the how the on how Love Island UK is really that deep. But no, if you think
Hmm.
about it, it basically is. So great way to wrap it up, man. Last question for you is, yeah, person. Um, I like your version of this question, so I'll do this. Which current or historical figure has most impacted your thinking? And it could be a few. Maybe there's some books in there too, but I'm just curious if anything comes to mind there.
There's loads of people that have certainly impacted my thinking, but to be honest, like I don't know if there's any one that I would for sure pull out, which is maybe I shouldn't ask that question, but I think the ones that I would highlight are Italo Calvino, who is a Italian author. He wrote a book called Invisible Cities. That's one of my favorites, and the way that he sort of like deconstructs reality in that book, I think, is something that like I ended up thinking about a ton,
That's cool.
and that has really stuck with me. And then Vladimir Nabokov, the writer of Lolita and Pale
Oh yeah.
Fire and stuff like that. Uh, Real strange guy, and
Yeah. I mean, if you
you
read
know,
Lolita, you know, yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, even
Incredibly written
outs,
book, but yeah, it's
yeah,
a
I think
classic for
there's
many different reasons.
like a really good Martin Amis essay on Nabokov, which I think like actually gets to the heart of some of the troubling pieces of him as a human, but that are unspoken. Um, but I think in terms of what is possible with the English language, no one has shown uh, shown that better that I've read, and especially done so in like the most demented and strange corners of like the human psyche. So
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah.
those would be there.
Awesome, man. I love those answers. Thank you. I know we're running out of time now, so we will actually wrap it up here. I could keep talking to you for ages, man, but
Me too,
hopefully we'll
man.
get to do that again soon in person. And yeah, man, this has been really, really fun. Anything else before we wrap up? I mean, obviously, I want to direct people to, is it generalist.com nowadays? Because it used to be Read the Generalist, but I think you have the .com
We got
now.
the generalist.com
There we
now, so
go.
head on over.
Oh, there we go. That's just flexing on them. All right. Generalist.com. Make sure you sign up. Genuinely one of the best newsletters out there. You do really deep work on that. It's free.
Thanks so
People can
much.
sign up and listen, read the bunch of the stuff you've got on there. You've also got paid stuff. So go and check it out over there. And wait, what, you used to do an audio version, but I haven't seen one recently. So did you stop doing the audio?
Wow, you're the first person to pick up on it. Honestly, we sort of did it by accident where we were like, oh man, like we're a bit behind. And then
Yeah.
I sort of continued doing it as an experiment where I was like, will anyone notice? Is this like a good use of my time? Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
always
fair.
a question for products, right? Like if you take a product away,
Does
do
anyone ask?
users get mad?
Yeah, it's like
Um,
the tree falling in a in a
yeah,
forest or
yeah,
whatever.
exactly.
That's
And you're the first
interesting.
person to mention it. So
Well, I wonder if there's going to be an AI product that comes around that helps
oh,
you. I
it's
mean,
right
there's
around the
Descript
corner.
already, which I think you can basically say it in your own voice, but I don't know for a whole essay if that's going to work very well.
Hmm.
But they've done a pretty amazing job with audio stuff.
It's crazy.
But yeah, that's interesting. The only reason I ask is because, to be completely frank, I have you're in the, top 5-10 newsletters I actually do read, because there's probably like 50 or 100 that I just never even get to open,
Yeah,
because it's,
I hear you.
it's quite a lot. And mainly because honestly, I listen to 10 times more than I read. So,
Totally.
but I will say the format of reading something out is actually not my favorite sort of audio, right? So that's another kind of challenge. And I think there's a space for people like you and Paki and others who are doing this amazing, written out, edited stuff to have discussions on it. But that's like, in the future, if you had unlimited resources, you'd maybe do something like that. But like sitting with someone like me and basically talking through the ideas or a discussion, I find that format to be quite useful personally, but that's just me, so it might not be lots of other people.
No, I think you're bang on. I think a lot of folks have more listen time than reading time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Well, anyway, so check out generalist.com. I'll share a few of those things we talked about. And yeah, I will see you soon in person, and appreciate you making time, man. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was a blast. I'll see you soon.
Cheers, dude. Bye-bye.